I'm looking out here, and in fact, I'm seeing a lot of people out of my past lives. Pete Haggart, who in 1965 I took my first communications class from. How wonderful to see you, Pete. Pat Costello, who I was on Governor Evans' staff with, and Pat is now in the College of Law faculty. Keith Peterson, who I worked the Centennial with. Dan Buckovich, who directed the jazz choir that my oldest daughter sang in. She was a student up here. What a pleasure to see you all, and so many of my colleagues in the university's executive leadership. One of the results of this series of lectures is supposed to be to better understand the various interplays in our many interrelationships. So I'm going to interlace this lecture with a series of lessons that I learned from my experiences prior to coming to work at the university, and then show you the universality of those lessons and how they have applied to my work at the university. They are also universal lessons that can apply to you and others regardless of where you are employed. First of all, you need to know that I am an Idaho Democrat, a Seattle Mariners fan for the entire history of the franchise, and a Vandal fan since I saw my first Vandal football game in Neal Stadium in 1957. So my entire life has been filled with lots of hope, but with minimal expectations. And this has pretty much prepared me well for what I have done. I'm an Idaho native. I was born in Lewiston, but that was primarily because Clarkston didn't have a hospital in 1943. So at the age of 3 days, I moved to Clarkston, less than a mile across the border from Idaho. As Rodney mentioned, I joined the Idaho National Guard on my 17th birthday in 1960 and began what has become a 51-year career of public service. For me, it's been a really remarkable journey, doing things that I never could have imagined, meeting people I never would have believed that I would meet, and all of this time spending most of my life within the state of Idaho. So the first lesson, and by the way, this is not an exhaustive list of lessons. When I went through the first write-up of this, I had a lot more lessons, and to save time, I just scrapped them. So this is the first lesson, and by the way, these lessons aren't necessarily in any order of preference. As a faculty or staff member, you may be in a position to exert a life-changing influence on a student. When I entered the university as a 21-year-old freshman in 1964, Dr. Gordon Law was chairman of the Department of Communications, where I majored in radio and TV broadcasting. In my case, he proved to be a model for the role that a faculty member can play in student success. During my final semester, Gordon asked me one day if I would join him for coffee at the house of a friend of his. The friend was a gentleman named J.R. Enscore, who turned out to be a major Democratic political operative in northern Idaho. We had coffee and talked for an hour or so, and he finally asked me if I would be interested in going to work for former Congressman Compton I. White. White was a congressman who had been defeated by Jim McClure 2 years earlier. I joined White's staff on June the 7th, 1968, the day after Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and began my odyssey through Idaho's government and politics. So, that does demonstrate how a faculty member can exert a lifelong influence on a student. Lesson number 2, everyone can be a mentor to someone. Never pass up that opportunity. It can have lifelong benefits for the individual being mentored. Comp White lost the 1968 election bid. However, within a month of his election, I was offered a position on the staff of Senator Frank Church in Washington, D.C. I joined Senator Church's staff and was immediately taken under the wing of his longtime chief of staff, Verda Barnes. Verda had moved to Washington after the election of Franklin Roosevelt. She became a close friend of both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and served as an assistant to Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes and Securities and Exchange Commissioner William O. Douglas. Verda became my mentor. I may have earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Idaho, but I went on to earn the equivalent of a PhD under Verda's wing on Frank Church's staff. To this day, I have a picture of Verda in my office taped to the bookcase. And when I'm faced with a very serious challenge, I often look at Verda's picture and ask myself, what would Verda do? Excuse me. You're going to have to suffer along with me. I've got a bit of a chest cold. Lesson number 3, think strategically. Life is a little like a game of chess. Always try to keep a few moves ahead of the opposition. When C. Sanders was elected governor, I returned from Washington, D.C. and joined his staff. I had a wide range of duties, but my proudest accomplishment of that part of my life came with the national recession of the early 1970s. Congress passed, in response to that recession, the Emergency Employment Act at the urging of President Nixon. The bill allocated funds to each state to create new public employment opportunities for the unemployed. I was charged with implementing the act in Idaho. After spending a lot of time pondering how best to make use of those funds, I had an idea. Andrus had tried without success in the previous legislative session to gain approval for a state-funded public kindergarten program. I suggested to him that we target a major portion of the new federal funds for hiring kindergarten teachers. We could fund the program for 1 year with federal funds and then seek continuation funding in the next session of the legislature. We established the program using classroom space in schools, storefronts, churches, YMCAs, and the like. And it was a huge success with the public. And just as we had suspected, it boxed the legislature in, leaving them no place to go but to approve continuation state funding of the program after that year. The legislature never really stood a chance. Lesson 4, never underestimate the importance of serendipity. While strategic thinking is extremely important, sometimes you can do great things by just stumbling around. One night in the 1970s, I was sitting at home when the doorbell rang. I answered it, and there was a lady standing there whom I had never seen before. She introduced herself and said she was running as a Republican for the Idaho House of Representatives. We chatted a bit about the issues. I was impressed, and I asked her if she needed any help on her campaign. She appeared momentarily stunned and said I was the first person she had talked to who had offered to help on her campaign. So I became her yard sign coordinator. Her name was Kitty Guernsey, and she won the election. Nearly a decade later, I was state budget director, and she was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and co-chair of the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. I doubt that any state budget director ever had a better relationship with a JFAC co-chair than I did. Lesson 5, never hesitate to figure out ways to make lemonade when handed a barrel of lemons. My next professional stop was as executive director of the Association of Idaho Cities. It was the era of the 1% property tax initiative, which meant the need to come up with alternative revenue sources for the cities. Does that sound familiar? From that came the sharing of state sales tax revenues with cities and counties. Also significant increases in other state revenues that are shared with cities, such as highway user fees and profits from the state liquor dispensary. In fact, I developed such a reputation for being a state government pickpocket that one statewide organization that didn't like what I was doing sent out a fundraising letter trying to raise funds to lobby against the work I was doing. I have a copy of that letter that I've kept to this day, and it's a wonderful memento. Lesson 6, the best way to ensure yourself of getting your way in difficult situations, not only in the legislature, but in many other places as well, is to form an effective coalition. Coalitions can make the seemingly impossible possible. Trying to keep the state budget in balance during this time became an all-consuming task for me. There's a gentleman named Tom Stivers, who was Speaker of the House, I would say, Pat is nodding his head. Those of us that had the displeasure of working with him, one of the nastiest people that I ever worked with in politics. Jim Risch was president pro tem of the Senate, and I worked for a Democratic governor. But we managed to put together coalitions and roll over the top of legislative leadership as we reduced spending and increased taxes. One day we forced the House to increase the level of funding for public schools above the level approved by JFAC. Representative Jerry Deckard, the floor leader for those efforts, a Republican legislator from Eagle, had a red rosebud placed at the desk of every House member who supported us. The next day, each of those same House members had a yellow rose placed on their desk courtesy of the Speaker of the House. Lesson 7. While the work of experts can sometimes be improved upon, choosing to ignore their advice can be perilous. During the 1980s recession, state revenue projections were a huge challenge, just as they sometimes are today. At the time, the state was using a very sophisticated econometric model that was located on a mainframe computer in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We seemed to be wrong about as often as we were right. About that time, I hired a new chief economist for the state. His name was Mike Ferguson. I asked Mike if he would add 2 additional elements to making revenue forecasts, in addition to the econometric model. The 2 elements that I asked him to add were long-time historical trends and common sense gut feelings. I think that we significantly improved the revenue projection process by adding those 2 elements. Given that, I was amazed last year when both the governor and the legislature chose to ignore Mike's revenue projections. And now, well into fiscal year 2012, they have discovered that Mike's projections were actually correct. Surprise, surprise. Lesson 8, just because you think you're always right doesn't mean that you actually are always right. But there are also times when you can make the wrong call. 2 such incidents come to mind. In 1970, I became friends with State Representative Lydia Justice Edwards. I had found out she was going to be delivering a speech to an organization. She was a ranking member of the House Transportation Committee. They wanted her to give a speech on state highway funding. I volunteered to write her speech for her. I've done that with a lot of legislators. Legislators generally aren't very good speech writers, and it really can endear you to them. Lydia and I, as a result of that, it cemented our friendship, and one day she came by my office and said she was considering running for state treasurer and needed my advice. I proceeded to give her my speech on just how useless and meaningless the office of elected state treasurer is. A week later, she came by, thanked me for my earlier advice, and said she was running for state treasurer. She eventually served 3 terms. Similarly, one day, Kathy Holland Smith came by to see me. I had promoted her from a secretarial position into a budget analyst position, and then when I left the budget office to take over the planning and administration of the state centennial, I took her along as my fiscal officer. Kathy was interested in applying for a budget analyst position with the legislature. I discouraged her from applying for a variety of reasons, but she went ahead and took the position, and today she directs the entire legislative budget staff. Lesson 9, you are generally better off following your heart rather than your pocketbook, within reason, of course. Also, know your personal limitations and don't let your ego be your guide in making major decisions. I have a passion for public service, but I've also had several opportunities over the years to go into private sector positions that would pay substantially more than I could ever make in the public sector. Joe Parkinson founded Micron Technology. He contacted me in 1986 and asked me to become his corporate controller. I told him that I didn't think I was qualified for the position since I had never taken a course in accounting and was pretty much self-taught in my budgeting and taxation work for the governor. He begged to differ and insisted that I come to work with him, but I didn't change my mind. Several years later, when I was working for the U of I and President Elizabeth Zinser was dealing with budget issues, Joe Parkinson was on the State Board of Education. Elizabeth eliminated the Vice President for Advancement position and terminated Harry Peterson, person in that position. Joe Parkinson got in touch with her after she had announced that decision and told her she had terminated the wrong Peterson. Joe did carry a grudge. For nearly 3 decades, the most influential person in the Idaho legislature was a staff person, a gentleman named Myron Schletke, who was director of the Legislative Council office. When he got ready to retire, he contacted me and asked me if I would go into a partnership with him running a lobbying firm. Between us, we probably knew more about state government, had a better institutional memory, and knew where more skeletons lay than any other 2 people in the State House. We could have made a lot of money, but I told him that in my heart I was a public servant and could only represent a single employer in the legislature, and it would have to be an employer whose cause I fully believed in. Lesson 10, keep and value your friendships and make every effort to make as many friends as you can make. I haven't touched on another important element of success. That's the importance of developing a network of friends and contacts. I have often unwittingly been doing this for years. Last year I was in Congressman Mike Simpson's office in Washington. The congressman commented that he had first met me as a 30-year-old dentist. He was the 30-year-old dentist, not me. As a 30-year-old dentist who had just been elected to the Blackfoot City Council. After the election, I'd come to Blackfoot as executive director of the Association of Idaho Cities and conducted a workshop for newly elected city officials. I have many professional friendships that go back that far. As people move on and up in life, you never know when those old friendships may prove useful. People I've known for 30 to 40 years include such individuals as Governor Butch Otter, Senator Jim Risch, former Senator Larry Craig, Congressman Mike Simpson, Supreme Court Justice Jim Jones, and Secretary of State Ben Usursa. Several months ago, President Nellis returned from a meeting of WICHE, the Western Interstate Compact for Higher Education. He said that Dave Longenecker, the director of WICHE, sent his greetings. Dave and I used to double date in Washington, D.C. in the 1960s when I was working on the Hill and he was a graduate student. He went on eventually to serve as Assistant Secretary of Education for Post-Secondary Education during the Clinton administration and is now with WICHE. So keep those old friendships. Lesson 11, there are few substitutes for good institutional memory. Speaking of the usefulness of old friendships, I also need to touch on the importance of institutional memory. I think that a lack of institutional memory within any organization can be nearly as big of a problem as a lack of adequate funding. Trial by error leaves a lot to be desired. I regularly get calls, invitations to have lunch with various state officials and persons involved in a wide range of organizations I've been involved with over the years, asking to pick my brain and enlighten them about something related to their current activities. Why do they do something the way they currently do it? Or what suggestions do I have for solving a current problem? When I joined Governor Andrus' staff in 1971, he used to complain about the lack of gray hair in his office. I didn't fully understand his concern at the time, but certainly do now. I've talked about the lessons I've learned in past jobs. Now, let me turn and focus on how those lessons from past jobs are universal lessons that apply to working here at the University of Idaho. I've known every U of I president back to and including Jess Buchanan. Although when I knew Jess, he was the lobbyist for the Asphalt Institute in Washington, D.C., and had been away from the university for about 25 years. Which, by the way, it may sound strange that he went from being president of the University of Idaho to being head of the Asphalt Institute in Washington, D.C., but if you look at the era, it made all the sense in the world. He became president of the Asphalt Institute at the time of the passage of the U.S. Defense and Interstate Highways Act, and was one of the most powerful lobbyists in Washington, D.C. at the time. I've had the pleasure of working as a special assistant to 7 presidents: Elizabeth Zinser, Tom Bell, Bob Hoover, Gary Michael, Tim White, Steve Daley Larson, and Dwayne Nellis. And I'm terribly flattered that Dwayne is here today And I've had to do away with the thing that I was going to do of ranking the presidents. This has given me an insider's view of the university that few have ever had. I've been through some of the university's best times and also through some of its worst times. So going back to the lessons that I learned in past lives, let me apply them to my time at the university. Lesson one, as a faculty or staff member, you may be in a position to exert a life-changing influence on a student. Back in the mid-1990s, the ASU selected a student lobbyist who decided to strike out on his own and run with a personal agenda in the legislature. I received a call one afternoon from a member of JFAC wanting to know if I knew what our student lobbyist was up to. Turned out that he was extremely conservative and that he had decided that the university should not be funding the Women's Center. He had arranged for a majority of the members of JFAC to support appropriations language that would have reduced the U of I's appropriation by the amount it budgeted for the Women's Center, with instructions that the U of I no longer fund the Women's Center. He had worked most of the session on that. But in less than a day, I had turned around all of his potential votes. Then I invited him to my office for a meeting, not knowing at the time whether I was going to throw him out of the window or just to have a face-to-face confrontation with him. I decided to spend some time with him and see if I might make him understand that what he had done was unethical. When all was said and done, we forged a good relationship. And several years later, he became an important contact for me on the staff of Senator Larry Craig. Lesson two, everyone can be a mentor to someone. Never pass up that opportunity. It can have lifelong benefits for the individual being mentored, not to mention potential future benefits for yourself. I took a lot of pride in the mentoring I did with staff during my years as state budget director. Several of them went on to hold significant positions in state government. Several years ago, when I was in my current position with the university, former employees of mine ended up in positions all at the same time that were very important to me and the university. The individuals at that time were State Budget Director Brad Fultman, Director of the old State Budget Bureau Judy Wright, the Chief Financial Officer for the State Board of Education Jeff Shin, and the Chief of Staff for the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee Kathy Holland Smith. Lesson three, think strategically. Life is a little like a game of chess. Always try to keep a few moves ahead of the opposition. A case in point is the university's plan to deliver a full 3-year law program in Boise. We're in partnership with the Supreme Court on an effort known as the Idaho Law Learning Center. During the Capitol restoration, the legislature moved into the old Ada County Courthouse, directly across the street from the Capitol, about as prime a piece of real estate from a governmental standpoint as there is. I was sure that once the legislature vacated that facility and moved back into the Capitol, people were going to be lining up immediately trying to get into the old courthouse. But it seemed to me that it was a prime facility for housing the Law Learning Center. So while the legislature was still in the courthouse, I began touching bases with primary individuals who would be making the decision on the future use of the building. Members of the Permanent Building Fund Advisory Council, the Director of the Department of Administration, the Administrator of the Division of Public Works, and the Governor. As a result, shortly after the legislature vacated the building, a sign went up identifying the building as the future home of the Idaho Law Learning Center. It's going to take several years for the state to come up with the funding to complete the renovation of the building, but at least there is now no one in line behind us trying to gain access to it. Lesson four, never underestimate the importance of serendipity. Several years ago, I received a phone call from a congressional staffer in Washington who thought I should be aware that the Washington lobbyist for Idaho State University was seeking an agricultural research earmark for ISU's Nuclear Accelerator Center to do potato testing. The account they were seeking the earmark from is generally only open to agricultural research programs at land-grant universities. The ISU lobbyist was aware of this restriction and intended to have the earmark pass through the U of I and on to ISU. ISU had never discussed this with the U of I, and I contacted the analyst with the appropriations subcommittee who was handling the request and asked that it be removed from the bill. And then I promptly forgot about the incident. Several months later, I was having lunch with the congressional staffer who'd first alerted me to this situation. He said that the Ag Research Appropriations Bill had been approved the previous day. And as he had been going through the bill, he discovered that because of a committee staffing error, the ISU request had actually ended up in the final bill. I asked to see the language, and it turned out that it made no mention of ISU or potatoes. The language broadly referred to funding for research in food safety, and that as the ISU lobbyists had originally planned, the funding would go to the University of Idaho. He asked me if we wanted to pursue getting those funds and keeping them at the U of I, and I told him yes. As a result, we not only got them for 1 year, we got them for several years, and we eventually, because of that, received over $7 million in funding from that earmark, which I think was really serendipity at its best. Lesson 5, never hesitate to try to figure out ways to make lemonade when handed a barrel of lemons. The days following the collapse of the University Place project were some of the bleakest days in the university's history. A popular president had resigned, many senior staff members had departed, and the university's budget was in complete disarray. But as interim president Gary Michael said repeatedly, the university's best days lay ahead in the future. A new president, Tim White, came on board. With him came the appointment of numerous new senior members of the administration. From the departure of many from the previous administrations came a new cadre of leadership with substantial skills and experience. And from this new leadership came major efforts to redefine the university through reductions, restructuring, and priority setting. For the first time in a long time, the university stopped trying to be all things to all people and worked on where it could most effectively focus limited financial resources. As a result of all of this, in many ways, the university became a model for much of the rest of state government when several years later the bottom fell out of the economy and all state agencies went through a series of holdbacks. Perhaps the best example of the university leading the way was with health insurance. The university made an extensive effort to involve the entire university community in making major revisions to its medical insurance program. As a result, while the end results may not have received accolades from all the staff and faculty, at least all were aware of the pending changes and had been given every opportunity to weigh in on them, and the changes were accepted by the employees, although in most cases very reluctantly. The state decided, when they decided to change their medical insurance program up 2 or 3 years ago, they came up to look at what we had done and promptly ignored all of the lessons that we had in communicating with staff and faculty on going about making the changes. They went ahead and just made the changes and announced one day, here's what's going to happen, and the fallout with state employees was substantial. Lesson 6, the best way to ensure yourself of getting your way in difficult situations, not only in the legislature, but in many other places as well, is to form an effective coalition. Coalitions can make the seemingly impossible possible. After the University Commons was completed, the next step was the renovation of the University Classroom Center. Getting the legislature to support that project was going to be very difficult. So I met with Governor Kempthorne and suggested that he propose a mayor higher education public works package to the legislature that would provide a project for each of the state's public colleges and universities using debt financing. He was reluctant. But I told him that if he would propose it, I would put together the strategy, I'd put together the coalition, and I promised him that I would make it happen. He relented and recommended it to the legislature. The Speaker of the House at the time said the proposal was dead on arrival. But I knew the parochialism of the legislature and higher education a lot better than the speaker did. The package had 7 projects, including the Teaching and Learning Center. Nearly every member of the legislature, thank you, nearly every member of the legislature had a project in that package. Well, you could hate the package. The only way that you were going to get your project support through was to support the package. I put together a coalition not only of the colleges and universities, but of contractors, construction trade unions, and local chambers of commerce. Thanks to the work of the coalition, the proposal eventually received overwhelming support in the legislature, even from the speaker who had said it was dead on arrival. Most major successes that we have had in the legislature in recent years, whether it was this construction project or the Center for Advanced Energy Studies, have come about because of the formation of coalitions. Lesson 7. While the work of experts can sometimes be improved upon, choosing to ignore their advice can be perilous. I think that one of the most perilous things for an individual is not recognizing what you don't know. I was heavily involved in the early stages of the University Place project in Boise. In fact, I am one of the few people left at the university who either had involvement in the project or who will admit to it. One day at a meeting of all the major players in the project, the then financial vice president presented a spreadsheet of revenue projections that would be used to pay debt service on the project bonds. I readily admitted to the group that I knew little about commercial real estate, but I did know how to read cash flow charts. I then proceeded to dispute each of the revenue figures and provided my justification for disputing them. This resulted in the financial VP going ballistic, shouting fairly abusive things at me, and me leaving the meeting. Later that day, I sent an email to President Hoover telling him of the incident and told him that since I had little more to offer to the project, I was withdrawing from it and suggested that he bring in a group of outside individuals who knew commercial real estate to sit down and analyze the project. That never happened, and he later told me that he wished he had acted on that recommendation. Later, when I was giving my deposition during the investigation into University Place, I told the investigators about this and said that I had subsequently passed my concerns on to the president during a conversation. One of the investigators leaned across the table and said that information I was providing was not correct, which immediately raised concerns with me. But then she said that I hadn't passed the information on in a conversation. I'd actually done it in an email, and she handed me a copy of the email that she had found. Lesson 8. Just because you think you're always right doesn't mean that you actually are always right. I could go back to my previous example of the problems with the University Place project. There were people involved with that project who were helping to steer it, who were convinced that they were doing everything right, when in fact they had little idea of what they were doing, had no understanding of commercial real estate, and unfortunately, the state fell into a disaster, but fortunately none of those individuals are any longer associated with the university. Lesson 9. You're generally better off following your heart rather than your pocketbook, within reason, of course. Also know your personal limitations and don't let your ego be your guide in making major decisions. I have had other job opportunities since I've been here at the university. The most amazing was from a group of individuals that hired a consultant to put together a strategy paper on how I could be elected to Congress from Idaho's 1st Congressional District. The truth was that reading through it, given the year, the time in the election cycle, I think they may well have been correct. However, as I told them, the problem with it was, while I could probably get elected, it would mean then I'd have to serve in Congress. That wasn't something that interested me, and in today's political climate, it might even be considered professionally a step down. Most recently, I had a representative of a major DC lobbying firm contact me and said that the firm was interested in opening a West Coast office and wondered, since I was leaving the U of I, would I be willing to go to work for them and run that office? I declined, indicating that if I wanted to continue to work, I would continue to work at the U of I, since it's a cause I fully believe in and a place where I fully enjoy working with all of my various colleagues. Lesson 10, keep and value your friendships and make every effort to make as many friends as you can. Several years ago, as part of our planning for the proposed dairy center, we discovered that the Morrill Act would not allow us to use proceeds from our land endowments for the construction of facilities. Being able to do that was a critical part of the plan for the facility. This was a federal law that dated back to the Lincoln administration, and it impacts every land-grant university in the country. The chances of getting all of the land-grant universities in the country together, working off at the same page, coming up with agreed-upon amendments to the law seemed remote. And even if we could, that process would take years. So, Kent Nelson and I, working with the Attorney General's office, came up with a completely different approach that would solve Idaho's problem and not involve any other universities. Rather than amending the Morrill Act, we would amend the 1890 Idaho Admissions Act that made Idaho a state. We would add language to the Admissions Act that said that Idaho didn't need to abide by the restrictions in the Morrill Act that prohibited use of land endowments for construction of facilities. We gave ourselves 2 years to get that legislation approved. With 2 years to get the legislation approved, Clive Strong, the director of the Natural Resources Division of the Attorney General's office, and I went to Washington to make the rounds of staff members from the Idaho Congressional Delegation and the Senate and House Agricultural Committees. After we finished a series of briefings, we were walking through one of the House office buildings and happened to walk by the office of the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee. On a whim, I told Clive I wanted to briefly stop by the office and see if a woman I used to date back in the 1960s still worked there. It turned out that not only did she, but she was executive assistant to the chairman. And she came out, gave me a big hug, and said she was glad we had stopped by. Wanted to know what we were up to. I told her about the legislation we were working on and said that a couple of days earlier, Congressman Simpson had introduced the bill, H.R. 3006, and it had been referred to the House Ag Committee. And if there was anything she could do to help it through the process, we would appreciate it. And help she did. 34 days later, after the bill was introduced, it was signed into law by President Bush. So keep and value your friendships. And if you are single and stop dating someone, don't just dump them, remain friends. Lesson 11. There are few substitutes for good institutional memory. A dozen years ago, we were looking for ways to increase the flow of scholarship money coming to the university. Traditionally, this is a university advancement exercise. But looking back to 1986, it occurred to me that a specialty license plate might be a possibility. I had 2 very successful specialty license plate proposals approved by the legislature in the past. The first was the Centennial license plate, which funded much of the state centennial activities. The second was a feed-off from that success, where we copyrighted the Centennial license plate on behalf of the Idaho Centennial Foundation and then ran legislation requiring the state to pay the foundation 50 cents per each new set of plates issued for use of the copyrighted design. Today, that copyright has generated over $5 million for the Idaho Heritage Trust to use on historic preservation projects. So I sat down with the staff of the State Board of Education and said that if the SBOE would support the effort, drawing on my experience from the 80s, I would draft legislation for college and university license plates and lobby it through the legislature. They agreed to it, and I carried through on my commitment. Since the legislation was approved, the University of Idaho has received about $250,000 in scholarship money that would not otherwise have come to the university. And all it took was jogging my institutional memory on a similar project from years past. These are just a few of the personal lessons that I've learned over the years. and that are in fact universal lessons for everyone. Using Rodney's wheel analogy, I'm the hub, the lesson spokes, and the rest of the universe is the rim. And by the way, before I close, I would be remiss if I didn't say that my lovely wife Barb is seated in the back between President Nellis and Kathy Aiken, and she has suffered through a large chunk of these 51 years of public service, not all of them, but and she is a font of patience. Let me close with the immortal words of Michael Stipe. I don't know if you know who Michael Stipe is, one of the members of the band REM. REM decided recently they were going to disband, and I thought his words at the press conference announcing they were dissolving were some of the finest I've ever heard. He said, "The skill in attending a party is knowing when to leave." And with that lesson in mind, on January 20th, I'm going to retire. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. Got a few minutes left for questions, if any of you have questions. You know, above all, I want you to know that it has been a pleasure working with each and every one of you, and you haven't seen the last of me. Kenton.
Marty, you spoke several times about the importance of institutional memory, and I'm thinking back to 1989, the centennial of this university, when there were intended to be 2 commemorations of the university's first 100 years. One was the wonderful pictorial history that Keith Peterson edited, and the other was supposed to be a scholarly history that would explore the politics and the academics of the university. And for reasons that you and Keith and I know, that piece was never done. I'm wondering whether the 125th anniversary of the university in 2014 would be an appropriate time to revive that project, and secondly, whether you'd be willing to write it.
Keith's got the jump on it. Keith already did the popular history. I think that is a great idea. As I recall, there was a third element in the University Centennial Celebration, and that was the planting of groves of trees in all 44 of the Idaho counties. And I've always been curious as to if those groves have grown and prospered in each of the counties. But, I think that, I won't commit on doing something like that. The reason I won't commit, Randy Staples and I are right now working on a book on the 100 most influential people in the history of the state of Idaho. And we're going to have the audacity not only of listing the 100 most influential people, but we're going to list them in order. Something surely to incite a lot of arguments. But I think the project you're talking about would be a great one, and it's something that I would be interested in talking to other people about getting involved in, because the political history of the university is the history of the university. The higher education in Idaho, I talked about the parochialism of higher education. There are a few things that are more parochial, more politically parochial in this state, or probably any other state, than its structure of higher education. When I went to work as budget director of the state, I was very frustrated with higher education funding, and looked around to see if there was a better model in the country. And I found it. There was one. State of Wyoming. One university, one campus. And in the mid-1980s, the University of Wyoming's budget was about the equivalent of what all 4 four-year institutions in Idaho were receiving combined. Yes?
Marty, I think it was partly with your blessing when you were budget director, and also John Andreessen, and Myron Shaletki.
Right.
You recruited faculty members to help you do the budget forecasting. I from the University of Idaho, Don Holly, Don Billings,
Right.
From Pocatello. The idea was to get academics budgets to see how they blend with Mike Ferguson's and yours, and then put them all together and synthesize and see what might be the best set of numbers. I think that is still going. At least I was involved in it till I retired in 2002. I think we initiated it with your, if you know, in '74. Were you the budget director in '74?
I wasn't in '74, but I was certainly, I was involved with the Revenue Projections Committee when I was budget director, and unfortunately, in recent years, the revenue projections, even though there is still university involvement, Don Holly is still still involved. Unfortunately, I think the revenue forecasting process in Idaho has become heavily politicized, and I think that's unfortunate. I commented on the fact that Mike Ferguson had made a correct forecast, and they had chosen to ignore it. Well, there's a little more to that story. It was Mike then retired shortly after that. But Cease Andrus was approached by somebody in the news media, and Cease Andrus bet Butch Otter $100 that Mike Ferguson would be right and the governor would be wrong. Cease won his $100.
Were you also involved with Don Samuelson, the Republican?
I was involved with Don Samuelson. I was involved with defeating Don Samuelson. Yes.
You weren't in the
I came out in 1970. You would go to prison now for what I did in 1970. I came out on the U.S. Senate payroll. In a U.S. Senate office, I ran a boiler room operation for Cecil Andrus's gubernatorial campaign. And if you tried doing something like that today, you'd get to spend a little time in federal prison, I suspect. But my involvement with Don Samuelson was in defeating him.
Finally, I thought you were involved in fundraising for Albertson, helping Byron Dangerfield and Gary Michaels for Albertson Building, private fundraiser. Were you
No.
connected with that?
I gave money to the building, but I wasn't involved in raising it.
So maybe you were too modest
Nope.
not to
Nope.
mention that.
Yes.
What is your take on whether university faculty should get involved with helping legislators solve specific problems for the state of Idaho? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it can be a good idea. I will give you an example of it being a good idea. I can remember back in the 70s, the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee would not look at state income tax legislation without bringing Professor Peterson from the College of Law down to Boise to meet with the committee and discuss it. Generally recognized expert, was respected by both sides, was very knowledgeable in it. I think that if there are very specific things that are, for example, science-based research that has bearings on legislation that people are looking at, I think that can be very important. I think if it's purely a philosophical thing, and I think to give you an example, maybe guns on campus. I fronted the Bruce Newcomb, my counterpart at Boise State, and I fronted the opposition to the guns on campus effort, and I think our efforts probably would have been hindered had we had faculty coming in trying to get involved. In fact, we did have one faculty member from Boise State who came in supporting the legislation, and I think she did herself no good at all doing that. So, I think faculty are a phenomenal resource. The Idaho legislature has only one committee that has full-time professional staff. That's the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. And we have not only the U of I, but a couple of other universities that have varying degrees of expertise in a wide range of subjects. And in fact, the legislature does make use of our folks. We have every year, the College of Agriculture is involved with the ag committees on various issues at the request of the ag committees. We have had, Roy, you and others have been involved in talking to legislature about issues like mine safety, that type of thing. So, I think there's every opportunity for faculty members to be involved with the legislature, but I think it needs to be selective, because I think the one thing you do not want to do is bust your pick off on an issue and have it be something that's going to ultimately damage the institution. Let me give you an example of that. I got a phone call a number of years ago from a member of Larry Craig's staff, absolutely irate, because unbeknownst to me, we had a faculty member who had come back, testified on a bill that Senator Craig had introduced, and testified in opposition to it. And they were understandably upset. And what we finally worked out, there is, First Amendment does apply to faculty. But what we finally worked out was Senator Craig held a second hearing. I recruited another faculty member to come back and testify in support of his bill. And that took care of the issue with them. But I think faculty have a very important role to play in that area. Okay.